Hi, how's it going? My name is Rob Dodson. I am a developer advocate here at the Googles. I work with the Chrome team. And my primary focus these days is on web accessibility, which is a topic that I've been working on for maybe about 2 years now, but I still feel like a kind of a newbie because there's always so much to learn in this space. But what I wanted to do today was just sort of cover a little bit of the fundamentals and give you a taste of some of the stuff that I work on every day. So first, what is accessibility, right? Let's define the term. So when we're talking about accessibility from an engineering perspective, oftentimes what people mean when they say that is that we're talking about giving users with disabilities or impairments alternative ways to access our content. And there's a number of reasons why we need to prioritize this work as engineers. So in many instances, you may have clients who are in the education space or the government space, or really possibly any business space, who might actually request that as part of your contract. Like anything that you're going to build for them, they want to make sure that that content is accessible. So for instance, if you're building something for a school, right, and they're going to ask all of their students to use it, you need to make sure that if a student has a vision impairment or something like that, they have equal access to that content. They can still get their education. In some countries, it's also mandated by law. So in the United States, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. We have Section 508C of the Rehabilitation Act. These things require different organizations to make sure that the things that they're building give equal access to everybody. There are similar laws in the UK and in Israel and kind of in other places around the world. So it's also something you've got to be mindful of as you're building stuff. But the real reason why I like to work on accessibility is because I feel like when you focus on accessibility, especially at the beginning of your project, you just end up building better stuff. So if you're building components, it means you spend more time thinking about, OK, well, how is this going to operate for a keyboard? How is this going to operate with a screen reader? For design, how is someone going to be able to use this application if they're in perhaps not an ideal environment, right? If they're outside and it's a very sunny day, we've got to make sure we've got enough contrast on the screen. So that benefits folks who are using things in different contexts. It also benefits folks who might have a low vision impairment. So there's a lot of reasons why we want to incorporate it into our process. So what I'm going to do today is not talk about the entire space because it's quite broad, but I wanted to talk about one particular aspect which I find very fascinating, which is screen reader access. So how do you take a website or a widget on your website and make sure that its content gets conveyed properly to someone who perhaps can't even see the screen and perhaps is using a screen reader to access the page? When we're talking about screen reader access, there's this notion that it's helpful to have in your head of affordances. And an affordance is really anything that affords a person an opportunity to take an action with something. Sort of the quintessential example of affordances is a teapot. So a teapot, right, they don't come with instruction manuals because you kind of don't need an instruction manual, right? You see that it's got this handle and it's got this spout, and you can kind of infer what those things are telling you about the object, right? I can pick this thing up by the handle. Something's probably going to come out of that spout, right? It's got this little lid on the top, and I can kind of tell by just the physical design of it that I can pick that thing up and do things with it. Door handle, right? It's another good example. So the trick here is when we are building websites and web applications, we often try and take these affordances and add them to our designs so that they're visual aspects. So for instance, a button. We try to make a button on our website look kind of like a three-dimensional button. We're trying to convey to someone that there's this visual affordance that says, hey, you can click on this thing, just like other buttons that you've seen in real life, right? We don't give everybody an instruction manual. The trick is, if someone is non-sighted, how do we convey those same visual affordances to that user, right? We can't rely on CSS. We can't rely on styling or anything like that. So we have to have an alternative way of conveying those affordances. So that's really our goal when we're thinking about screen reader access. When we're thinking about this aspect of web design, is how do we convey these affordances to our users? How do we give them these alternatives? And when I first got into this space, I was like, well, I don't know, I've seen these Aria attributes in HTML before, so I guess I go to Stack Overflow and I Google how do I do this, and then I copy these Aria things and I paste them into the page, and that's how it works, right? And about a year ago, a member of Chrome's accessibility team sat me down and was like, I want to explain to you how Chrome, actually, under the hood, talks to to a screen reader? Like, what is happening at that level? How does Chrome figure out what to say to someone who's using a screen reader? And for me, this was like pretty mind-expanding, and I feel like it's kind of a missing piece from a lot of developer education. Most of us don't like working on accessibility because it just feels arcane. We don't quite understand how it works, and so we're just like, I don't want to deal with that. But once you understand what's going on under the hood, it's like pretty empowering, and then you get really into working on it. So that's one of the things I want to talk about today, just what's going on under the hood in Chrome when we're using a screen reader. So start off, we're building a website, right? We start with HTML, right? And from that, I think maybe some of you are familiar with the fact that our HTML, it gets parsed by the browser and gets turned into this thing called the DOM, or the Document Object Model, which is just a collection of JavaScript objects that sort of correspond with those HTML tags that we wrote. And then from this, our DOM gets combined with CSS, and eventually we draw something to the screen, right? We get our graphical user interface. We get our website. What I think most developers don't know, and which I didn't know, is that this is not the end of the process. The other thing that Chrome does is it takes the DOM and it creates another tree called the accessibility tree. And this is also full of nodes that correspond pretty much with what's in the DOM. But we do things like we edit out stuff that is not semantically interesting. So for instance, if you have a bunch of divs and all they do is like position things on screen, we're like, nah, we don't really need those, so we kind of prune those out. But if you have buttons or text or anything like that, we're like, oh yeah, we definitely need that. That's important. Let's keep that in this tree. And so we take that accessibility tree, and when someone turns on a screen reader, we basically are giving them that tree. And that's what they're navigating. That's what they're moving around inside. And they can do interesting things, right? They can use the screen reader to send an action back through the system. They can say, hey, I want to click on this thing, or I want to move to the next node in this tree. And under the hood, that's the conversation that's going on between Chrome and a screen reader. That's all that's happening. So to put this in slightly more concrete terms, here's some HTML that I've written. Over on the right there, I've got my accessibility tree. You can actually play around in like Chrome's flags and get it to like show you the accessibility tree sometimes, which is pretty neat. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a sec. But you can see that this tree is obviously not the same size. Like we've parsed out some of it. So the HTML tag, the head tag, the title tag, we kind of like condensed all of that into that first element there. And the only thing that we've got in that element is the fact that it's got this web area role and it's got a name, which is corresponding to the title of our page. What's really interesting is you look at this label and this input here, and you look at ID node 2 and 3. And if you check those out, you can actually see that there's sort of a relationship going on between those two nodes there. The text field, this ID3 element, has this labeled by IDs field that points at that label element. So that's how we label our text fields and things like that. So that's really what we're doing under the hood in Chrome. We're just sort of building this sparse tree and handing that off to assistive technology, which is kind of cool. So for any chunk of HTML, any component, anything like that that you're creating, you can expect there to be a few properties to that node in the accessibility tree. So in this case, I've got like a select, like a drop-down element that's got a little corresponding label for a seat type, like I'm buying a seat on an airplane, right? So for this select node, there's a few properties. There's going to be a role property that will be announced by the screen reader to tell the user what kind of control they're interacting with in the moment. So in this case, the select element has a role of combo box, because that kind of comes from the operating system. It'll have a name, and that name usually comes from a label of some kind. So you'll land on this thing, and it'll say preferred seat type, combo box. OK, cool. I know I'm on this control, and it's for picking a seat type. Some controls have states. Not all of them do, but some do. So for instance, the checkbox could be checked or unchecked. In this case, our dropdown is in a collapsed state. And then some controls have values. Right? Again, not all of them do, but in this case, since we maybe picked the aisle seat or something like that, the value would be aisle seat. Okay? So we just have a tree of nodes with this kind of semantic information inside of it. What's really cool is as of Chrome 64, you can actually now go in and inspect the accessibility tree. So the same way that you inspect elements and you look at their CSS properties and you toggle those and play around with those, my teammate Alice Boxhall worked on this new inspector, which is also in the Elements panel. And so in this case, you can kind of see it up there on the top. I've got a select element that I'm inspecting over in my Elements pane. And on the far side there, I can actually see that there's the accessibility tree. I can see the combo box. I can see all these interesting computed properties about it, like its name and where it derives its label from, its state, et cetera. So this is a really, really helpful tool for any time you're trying to like debug a widget. You're sort of like playing around with your screen reader, and you're like, why is this thing not saying what I think it should be saying? You now actually have a way to go in and inspect what's happening under the hood, what Chrome is handing off to that assistive technology. So native HTML elements, built-in elements, button, select, input, things like that. All of these elements have built-in implicit semantics. When I was first learning HTML, people were always like, you got to use semantic HTML. You really need to write semantic HTML. And I was like, I don't really understand why that matters. Like, who cares? Like, if I have like a H1 or just a div with some text that I make real big, like, it just looks the same. So like, who cares? This is why it's important. Because these elements have these built-in semantics that get announced by the screen reader. So anybody who's non-sighted, right, this is just telling them, yo, you're on a text field. Type some stuff, right? There are also elements which act as landmarks. These are really cool. So these elements, you can think of them as like hot spots on the page, kind of. And anyone using a screen reader can quickly jump to these areas of the page. So they can sort of like navigate around like a power user. How many of you use Vim or have ever used Vim? A few of you? OK, so you know how like when you're using Vim, you can like you can just fly around the page, right? Like I kind of think of landmark elements like that. So imagine if you had like a really busy navigation full of like links and anchors, and every single time someone comes to your site, they have to like tab through every single one of those things. That would suck, right? But if you have a main element, they can just hit a button and just like jump right to that main element. In fact, most folks report when they are on an unfamiliar website, they typically start off by navigating by header in their screen reader. So this is one of the reasons why we're always saying like, hey, H1 through H6, they're very important. And like, don't skip levels. Like, use them in sequential order and just style them to be different sizes if you need them to be different sizes. Because that's how someone using a screen reader forms like a mental outline of your page. And that's how they're going to quickly get around. So here's an example of a site. This is WebAIM, which is a really, really good resource for learning accessibility. And what I wanted to show here was just this like cool power user feature in VoiceOver, which is the screen reader that just comes for free on the Mac. This is a thing called the web rotor. And you can think of it, if you ever use your IDE and you hit like Command-Shift-P and you get that like Uber menu that shows you like all the options, like this is kind of like that, but for screen readers. So I want to show you some different ways that we can navigate. So for instance, I can go here. This box is what my screen reader is actually announcing. And I can go by like banner, navigation, search, main, and you can see this black rectangle indicating where screen reader focus is. I can go by like articles. I can go by this thing called window spots, which I have no idea what that is, links, headings, right? There we go. So I can navigate by headings in different ways. There are keyboard shortcuts that let me just navigate by heading, or there's like an Uber menu that I can use to like kind of see all of that stuff. So I just think this is really neat, and it helps you, when you're first learning a screen reader, kind of figure out, OK, cool, I see how people get around the document that way. OK, so built-in elements, semantic elements, they have rich semantics, which is good. That's why we encourage you to use them. Generic elements have generic semantics. So for instance, a div is a generic grouping element. Like in the HTML spec, like a div is just for like grouping things, right? So when we use generic elements to do stuff like act as a button, we're sort of messing up the semantics then. And so even though I've styled this thing to look like a button, even though it has the right visual affordances for a sighted user, for a non-sighted user, when they land on this control, it's just going to say sign up group. And that doesn't imply that this is something you can take action on, right? I can't a group. Do I click on a group? I don't think so. It just sounds like it's some text. And so there's a very, very good chance the user might just keep on moving, that they may never click this button. And that's a really big problem if, for instance, this is your create a new account button or like add thing to your shopping cart button or anything like that, right? So you want to make sure that anytime you're building a control that you're giving it the right semantics. And the easiest way to do that is usually just to use the right HTML element. So this is like one just tip I try and tell everybody, like don't make your life hard. Don't make it so you have to do extra work just to like ship your application. Use the right element for the job. If you're building a button, use the button element. Don't use a div or anything like that, because you're going to end up, after product review and everything, having to add back in all of these semantics after people start filing bugs on your thing that it doesn't work with screen readers, right? So use the right element, and it'll make your life a lot easier. Now, sometimes you're in a situation where there's no existing element for what you're trying to build, right? We don't have a tabs element in HTML. We don't have a carousel element or a expandable tree widget element. We don't have that stuff. And so there are times when you do have to go off-road, and you do have to build your own custom controls. And so it's only in these scenarios that we then turn to this thing called Aria, or Aria, which stands for the Web Accessibility Initiative Accessible Rich Internet Applications Specification, which is a mouthful. But basically, all this does is it just lets you add semantics to a control. So you could take a div, and you could make it announce as something else, essentially. The one really important thing to understand about Aria is that all it does is change semantics. It just changes what a screen reader is going to announce to a user. It does not add cool new behavior. So for instance, if you put Aria on something, it's not like suddenly it's, you can navigate it perfectly with a keyboard. It doesn't correspond perfectly to up-down arrow keys or anything like that, right? You still have to do the additional work of adding that in JavaScript. The only thing Aria does is changes what a screen reader is going to announce when it lands on a control. So it's useful, but again, you don't want to use it unless you absolutely have to, because it's a lot of extra work versus using a native control. I like to say that it lets you fill in gaps, missing pieces in that accessibility tree. So I want to show you, or actually, before we do that, so this is our diagram, right, that we did before. So Aria is just operating right in here. Right before Chrome is going to hand the thing off, the accessibility tree to assistive technology, we can go in and we can say, actually, that was a button, not a div. So yeah, how do you learn it? I think myself, most developers, the way that I learned it was, again, Stack Overflow and stuff. I'd be someone would file a bug. They'd be like, this button doesn't work with a screen reader. Google how to make a button work with a screen reader, and then copy and paste some code. So eventually, I got serious about this. I was like, OK, I want to learn Aria. So there's two ways to learn Aria, I think. The first way is the way that I first attempted it, which is you just go and you try and read the Aria specification. It comes with this very helpful diagram. I would not recommend this way. Yeah. I mean, it's actually fascinating that someone took the time to do this, but no, this is the hard way to do it. The other way, which I do recommend, the easy way, is there's this magical document. And I know this document does not look magical. This document looks boring. It's the classic W3C blue on white text thing that you sometimes wander into from a Google search and you're just didn't mean to be there, and you leave immediately. But this is not like other W3C docs, okay? So this one is written for folks to actually read. This is the Aria Authoring Practices Guide. And the way it is laid out is, on one side, it just lists common UI patterns. So accordion, tabs, dialog, combo box, et cetera, right? Autocomplete. Stuff that you may be attempting to build in the moment. So you find the pattern for the thing that you're trying to build. So in this case, let's say I'm building a custom checkbox. Again, you should not do that because there's a native checkbox, but let's say you were. You can go click the checkbox field, and then it'll just tell you what to do. It's OK, your element, it must have a role of checkbox. It's got to have an accessible label with Aria Label By. It must have Aria checked set to true, unless it is unchecked and set it to false, right? And they even have little JavaScript examples that are written in just vanilla JavaScript that you can look at. Even if you go further down, it'll tell you the expected keyboarding behavior. So it's when someone presses spacebar, that is when it is checked or unchecked, et cetera. Super useful, right? This is how I recommend people learn Aria. Just sort of if you happen to be building a custom widget, go here, implement the stuff, and kind of just you do that a few times, and eventually you sort of learn the attributes. You're oh yeah, Aria checked. I know what Aria checked does. OK, so let's do an example, and we're going to use those fancy new dev tools. This is going to be video. I'm not I'm not going to live code this thing, because I'd fail if I did. But what we're going to do here is we're going to build a checkbox. And I've already got my little checkbox up there that I've started. And then I've got a little bit of markup here. So you can see I'm using a div to build this checkbox. Again, I shouldn't do that, but I am. And then I've got this accessibility tree inspector thing over here on the far side. Okay, so let's see what happens. So we click on this thing, and it behaves like a checkbox. And we might think, oh, my job is done, right? I even added keyboard support. So you can tab to it and hit spacebar and stuff, and it totally works. And I might be like, oh, yeah, my job is done. Let's turn on a screen reader now and look at it. So you're going to see this little black rectangle here. This is what my screen reader is saying. And my screen reader, when I land on this control, it just says group. That's it. That's all it says. If someone's going through my site, they're trying to, I don't know, check off one of their to-dos or something, and it just says group. OK, well, that's useless. Now remember, though, we go to the Aria Authoring Practices Guide, and the first thing it told us was, you got to have a role of checkbox. You got to have Aria checked, true and false. OK, I can do this. All right? So I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to select my element in the Elements panel. And I'm just going to edit it. And keep an eye on what happens to our tree over here. So I'm going to edit it. I'm going to add an attribute. I'm going to add a role attribute of checkbox. And right away, it starts updating. So now we have a computed role of checkbox. Right? It even inferred that checked was false, which is kind of cool, even though it's actually checked. So we'll set Aria checked equals to true, because it's actually checked right now. All right, so now it says checkbox checked. Let's try with a screen reader. So we go to VoiceOver, we focus it, and it says check checkbox. Rad. OK, this is going to happen. All right. The next thing we want to do, though, is give it a label. Right? Because right now, if someone's navigating around the screen and something just says check checkbox, it's like, well, check checkbox for what? Like, again, keep in mind, if a user is non-sighted, even if the next thing they hear is like, sign up or whatever this checkbox is for, they don't visually know how far that thing is on the screen from that text that they're reading, right? It could be something far away. It could be like not actually visually related. So we need to make sure that every control has like a good relationship with its label, so someone understands what that control is actually for. So labels help a user understand the purpose of a control, right? There's a few different ways that we can label things. You're already probably familiar with one of the most common ones, which actually isn't this yet, but alt text on images, right? Give an image an alt text, you describe like the alternative content. That's a label, right? That gets announced by a screen reader as the alternative for that. The other one that most developers are familiar with is the label element, right? So you can wrap an element in a label, like a native like form input or something like that. You can also associate a label with a control by using the ID of that control. So you can use the label's for attribute, and you can point it at the ID for a control. So in this case, I've got a label element. I've got some text inside of it that says first name. And then I've got an input field. And if someone was to land on, if someone was to actually focus that input field with their screen reader, it'll say first name edit text, like real quick like that. So they're like, oh, cool, OK, I know what this edit text is for. It's for my first name. The limitation with label is that it only works with certain form elements. So like input, I think button, maybe select, yeah, probably select. But if you're building like a custom widget, if you're building like a custom thing out of a div, or you're using like a web component or something like that, label is going to do you no good, unfortunately. So then we start to check out our friend Aria again. So in Aria land, we've got about 2 ways that we can label things. The first is Aria Label. This is an attribute. You just put it on an element, and it acts as like a text alternative for that element. I think probably like the best use case for this is, when you're on like a responsive website and you've got that like hamburger menu button that, even though we never really explained how those things worked, we just sort of assumed everyone like got it after some point. OK, so like if someone's using a screen reader, we got to tell them, yo, that's the menu, right? And so giving it an Aria label, we give that button a text alternative, because usually we don't write any text on screen around those things. So it's a really, really good time to just put an Aria label on it. So that way, someone lands on that button with a screen reader, it says main menu button. They're like, oh, cool. I know what clicking that will do. The other option is Aria Labeled By. So Aria Labeled By lets you point at another element and say, hey, the text from that other element that provides my labeling. So Aria Label By is pretty interesting because you can point at multiple elements and say, actually, my label comes from that, and from that, and from that, and you can build like a compound label. So you just space separate the IDs in the attribute. So in this case, I have this heading, men's outerwear, and I have a button underneath called Shop Now. And so I point at the label, or I point at the ID for men's outerwear, and then this interesting thing you can do is you can actually point even at yourself and like use your own text content. So I'm pointing at the header, I'm pointing at the text content from my button, and the total thing that it says is men's outerwear shop now button. Cool. All right, that works. So for that checkbox that I was building, I'm probably going to put some text on screen next to this thing that tells a sighted user what the checkbox is for. And so that's a good opportunity for me to use Aria Labeled By to associate that. So I'm just going to go in and actually edit this as HTML. I'll just add another div with some text in here that says like sign up or something like that. Maybe I'm trying to get them to sign up for my newsletter. So I say sign up. I have to give my div an ID. Much of Aria works with IDs, which I know a lot of web developers are like, no, but like that's just the way Aria is. And then I can give that other element an Aria Labeled By, and I can point at the ID for my div. And now if you look in my inspector over here, I can see, yes, the name is coming from that labeling element. And I can use my screen reader and focus it. I can see now it says sign up, checkbox. Great. So I went from my div, which only had visual affordances, to this semantically rich control. Now anyone can use it. So we talked about a tiny fraction of web accessibility, but one that I think is probably most confusing for developers, and so I just really wanted to share it with y'all today. We do have other resources that are available on this topic, so you can learn more about it because it is big and very interesting. I do a YouTube series that comes out every 2 weeks that we are currently on hiatus because I'm on an engineering rotation, but it'll start again next quarter. So we do this every 2 weeks. They're 5-minute videos. We just talk about like accessibility topics, stuff that I think is interesting or cool, showing off like new dev tools and stuff like that. Like that's what we're doing. So hopefully fun stuff. Myself, my teammate Alice Boxhall, we also put together a course on web accessibility that is available on Udacity. Do the course, do the certification, right? Trying to get you ready for that. And then we also have a text version, essentially, of that course up on developers.google.com, which I shortened the link for you there, bit.ly/A11Y fundamentals. Anytime you see A11Y, that stands for accessibility. It's just accessibility is hard to spell, so everyone does A, 11 letters in between Y. So that's what that means. That's why everyone does that. I think that's just about it. Review. The main thing we're trying to do anytime we're building custom controls, anything we're building anything for the web, is making sure that we are offering the right affordances to our users, so whichever way they are accessing that content, they have the best, richest experience possible. Ideally do this using native elements, but if you can't, that's when you reach for something like Aria and expose those semantics to your user. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.